All right, everyone. Hi there. I'm recording not from my classroom because I have been prohibited from doing so. Here are our videos on um, 6.1 and 6.2, which are probably some of them. Well, 6.2 is one of the densest chapters I think we've had all year. There are 40 terms. And before you think, man, Jennings and my teachers inflict this textbook on me, y'all, I did this note. I just made these notes. So like I just took the notes before you guys did. So I am as sympathetic as it comes. So the first chapter is going to talk about all the reasons Europeans came up with to expand. That these are going to be commonalities. Like we've been talking about state expansion for the past, semester and a quarter. So none of these ideas will be new, but the specific things they talk about and how they rationalize their expansion are slightly different. So this chapter is a little bit more manageable, and that is only one page of vocab, only 10 terms in total. Sorry. So these are stuff for you to pause and record. All right. So let's get into this. So the first division that AMSCO gives for expansion is really interesting, like nationalist expansion, where the nations of Europe in this creation of a national consciousness, this idea that like France is a thing that needs to be like upheld and made strong, or Britain is a thing that needs to be upheld and made strong, that compels nations to go out and find colonies that can strengthen the nation. The term is called like the metropole, which is like the central nation in an empire. So AMSCO articulates this in a lot of ways like compensation for like shame or other losses. Like, so for example, when Britain loses the 13 colonies in the American Revolution, they seek to find colonies to, first of all, economically replace the loss of those 13 colonies in North America, but also because a strong nation needs colonies to provide advantageous trade relationships for them, right? And so the areas they go to is Australia, but also like Britain's control of India, like India being important to Britain becomes a part of the national identity, right? So much so that many of the crown jewels come from South Asia, right? In the meantime, France, they lose what becomes Canada and also a part of actual French territory in the Franco-Prussian War. And I don't know. AMSCO talks about how, like, France continues to expand. The 1830s, they come in to take over Algeria, which is in Mediterranean North Africa. And then Indochina, which is going to be the modern day countries of Laos, Cambodia, and Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, the South Pacific and Senegal, and other places in West Africa that also like strengthen the French state. Japan also comes to see that expansion is a part of the national identity, and so they want to expand into areas that states already occupy, right? One of the biggest challenges to these nationalist aspirations is that most of the places of the world right now are occupied by states that these other nations say exist, but they want to expand into them. And so Japan fights China. And what's so important about Japan's victory in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, which happens right at the end of this unit, is that it's a pretty massive change from what we've been talking about regarding East Asian history. That when Japan fights and defeats China in a war, they also are supplanting China as the most influential nation in East Asia. And that's a really big change. They also seize control of Formosa as a consequence of the Sino-Japanese War, and that is modern-day Taiwan. So that is an area, that's an island, it's near off the coast. It kind of like gives them some training advantages and like has some resources itself. So they kind of have to take territory from something else, right? When these nations want to expand, and they're going to expand where they think they're able to expand, right? That's like the whole thing about expansionism. States are fluid in that way, where like they go kind of in the direction where they are enabled to go. They don't attack strong nations. They attack nations that they perceive are weak or nations that they perceive are beatable. So when we talk about like the motivations for the cultural and religious motivations for imperialism, the main thing to think about here would be that Europeans are trying to figure out why this event has occurred, where Europe has become this like political center of the world, an economic center of the world, after, you know, the human story up to this point being not that. And so the first and most kind of like facile or simplistic way to look at it would be there has to be something innate about the people that live in Europe that led to this moment, right? And so this leads to, in a lot of ways, the creation of the concept of race, right? Like we always, I mean, people have been different skin colors for, you know, ever since we've had people. But what a person's skin color means has developed and changed as a reflection of our culture. And so a lot of people are like, well, all of us are white and all the people we're conquering are not white. So there must be something about our whiteness, right? And all the biology that comes with whiteness that have enabled us to, right? And so that's like they use like a biological explanation that like white people are just like genetically superior to non-white people, right? You also have like the consequences of culture, that Christianity, right, is what enabled Europeans to be successful, because Christianity is the common theme that connects all Europeans. But now that Europeans have like adopted these new ways of talking about the world through things like the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution, they seek to back up their they try to prove these racist statements true through scientific inquiry. So, for example, eugenics and phrenology. Phrenology is like someone who specifically like focused on the study of like differences in human biology as a way to explain like racism. So they measure the size of a black person's skull and compare it to a white person's skull, and whatever conclusions they'd come to is what, like, about the size difference or like the brain size or brain weight, whatever it was. They would use those observations, right? Using the senses to figure out what's going on in the world to come to a conclusion about why Europeans are superior to non-Europeans. Now, the thing to really emphasize about this would be that this scientific inquiry is at the baseline flawed, because it does not ask the question, are Europeans like genetically or whatever superior to non-Europeans? It asks the questions, why are Europeans superior to other groups, right? Which is an assumption of itself. When you are assuming that they are superior innately, then you will look at the data and your data will be biased and you will come to a flawed conclusion instead of trying to figure out in the first place if they are, right? They just assumed they were superior. And that's why eugenics, phrenology, and any kind of other racist science system is at the baseline flawed, because this assumption, it is guided by a flawed assumption that's not scientifically proven. Because also, when we talk about superiority, there's a lot of ways to define superiority that will lead you to different conclusions about what group or something would be superior, right? So those are some things to keep in mind about it. When Darwin came up with his theory of evolution, he talked about the concept of survival of the fittest. Fitness is like the idea of like your environment, that you if a organism has the right attributes to propagate its genes, therefore it is like fit. It fits into the environment or the biome adequately, and then can like continue to share and its genes, and those attributes will perpetuate themselves, right? A social Darwinist looked at that theory of biology and tried to appropriate it to human society and culture, where they came to believe that non-European cultures and societies were no longer fit for existence on this planet, and therefore would eventually die out, right? Would become extinct. And the logical flaw with this system would be that culture is not a static thing. Cultures morph continually. Cultures are in flux. Cultures are not ever anything that's concrete, right? That like we all belong to like many cultural groups. You know, we live in America. We're Texans. We're Austinites. We're people who live in Northwest Austin. All those are like subsets of culture. But if you asked me what that meant and what that meant, we would have a bunch of different conclusions about what that actually comes to, right? And so when you think that like a culture or a culture or a race is like one static thing, then I guess at some point it would cease to exist. But also, it's not like European culture is staying static in this interaction with other cultures throughout this global system of exchange as imperialism, right? The really important thing, though, about this is when Europeans come to occupy and control these non-European spaces in Africa, in the Middle East, or in East Asia, or the rest of the world, they have the influence and leverage to impose their culture more on these subject peoples than these subject peoples can express their culture or change the people. That change still occurs, right? There are still people, Europeans still change through this process. It's just European states in general operate with a degree of hostility towards these indigenous culture groups, right? So they enact policies among Arab and Islamic populations that are Arab phobic or Islamophobic, right? They also do the same thing to African cultures, where they try to convert them to Christianity or force them to learn the languages of the conquering nation, of French or English or things like that. And those cultures persist among that, right? Like people who live in what becomes eventually Ghana and the Gold Coast, they don't stop being the ethnic group that they are. What it means to be a member of that ethnic group changes through its contact with Britain, right? And so like that's why you can't, like, the culture's never going to die out, right? It's just because the culture constantly iterates itself. And then finally, I kind of already applied this, but they're also converting people to the primary religion of Europe, which would be Christianity. And when we look at like the language that Europeans use to make what they're doing sound palatable, it's very consistently to uplift people. Your AMSCO chapter starts with a very famous poem by the writer Rudyard Kipling called "Take Up the White Man's" or called "The White Man's Burden," about like this white person's obligation to uplift non-white people through the process of imperialism and colonialism. I can't remember how much of a satire it is or it isn't. It sometimes is taken sincerely, sometimes sounds a little bit too absurd, even in the time of its being of the time of its writing, to actually be taken seriously. But is a text that you'll probably interact with quite a bit throughout your education. Okay. Our final subtopic is about economic motives for imperialism, and this is probably what's driving more imperialism than the cultural reasons or the nationalistic reasons. Those are both abstract concepts, and economics is a very material thing, and so through that, you can see that that's probably going to drive people's actions more than like these cultural desires or these nationalistic desires. So as nations are industrializing, they need access to two things. They need access to raw materials, and they need access to markets to purchase the materials they produce through industrialization. And so companies like the East India Company become extremely vital towards the economic health of the British nation. Britain gives them a monopoly on trade with India, and through that monopoly, they become immensely wealthy. They are able to afford to sponsor and pay massive armies that end up overthrowing and pushing out the rest of the other states in Europe, and putting all those states in India, putting all those states under British control, but specifically not the British government's control, but the control of the East India Company. And then once the East India Company has a centralized role in controlling South Asia, they begin to dominate the trade that hinged upon interactions with South Asia. So they come to dominate Middle Eastern trade, specifically sea-based trade, Eastern coastal Africa. East Africa, a lot of it's under British influence because it's just kind of like the East India trade the Indian Ocean trade in a way becomes tremendously influenced by the British, and also they sneak up into into East Asia and China as well. Sorry, my brain's a little bit, yeah. And East India control lasts until the 1860s, essentially, right around this 1860s when it wraps up. So the Dutch East India Company is another company that integrates into Indian Ocean trade, and they're controlling territory as well until the 18th century, 19th century. Now, what's really important is that after the Napoleonic Wars that really get rushed over in AMSCO, like by 1815, Britain, with its colonial wealth, its control of South Asia, its control of like Canada and North America, its growing control of Australia, and then its growing interest in Africa, is pretty much like the unparalleled greatest power in the world. It's not quite the biggest empire in human history yet. It becomes that throughout the 19th century. But eventually, other states are going to rise through their own expansion to also be as powerful or close to as powerful as Great Britain itself. So that's our 6.1 lecture. And we have a long one next one. We have this one as a long one. So I will see you guys in those videos. It's probably a two-parter like last time.